Bom, boa tarde, bem-vindos à Cátedra Design, Arte e Ciência. Essa cátedra aí tem o objetivo de aprofundar essa relação entre design, arte e ciência, revisando métodos teóricos e práticos, apresentado aqui por professores, artistas e cientistas convidados. Ela é concebida como um sistema aberto, que vem aí facilitar metodologias experimentais inovadoras que visam responder aos desafios contemporâneos a partir de dinâmicas próprias de investigação e criação. Então, nesse contexto de pensar e produzir em rede, agradecemos as parcerias institucionais que validam e consolidam este encontro. Da Universidade Jorge Tadeu Lozano, professor Felipe César Londonho, da Universidade de Buenos Aires, professor Martin Grossman, da Universidade do Chile, professor Daniel Cruz, da Universidade Federal de Goiás, professor Cleomar Rocha, e da Universidade Autônoma do México, professora Tânia Aedo. Este semestre, a coordenação da cátedra acontece aqui no Brasil, através da rede Media Lab Brasil, que tem aí no Media Lab UFG, o professor Cleomar Rocha, o Media Lab Instituto Mauá de Tecnologia, professora Águida Carvalho, o Media Lab Unifespa, que é o professor Teófilo Augusto da Silva, e o Media Lab UNB, professor Antenor Ferreira Correia e a professora Suzete Venturelli, e o Media Lab PUC Campinas, que é a professora Paula Mozara, e eu, Luísa Paraguá. Gostaríamos de mais uma vez agradecer, na pessoa do reitor, professor José Carlos de Souza Júnior, ao Instituto Mauá de Tecnologia, que está sediando a cátedra neste semestre, e toda a equipe de produção, sob a coordenação da professora Águida Carvalho. Também agradecer à professora Silvia, da Faculdade de Artes e Design, da Universidade Jorge Tadeu Lozano, que tem colaborado aí imensamente nessa coordenação brasileira. Bom, hoje a gente tem a professora pesquisadora Adriana de Souza e Silva, e aí eu passo a palavra para a professora Eliane, aqui do programa de pós-graduação em Linguagens, Mídia e Arte, já agradecendo também, Eliane, por sua mediação hoje com a professora Adriana. Obrigada.
Okay, a very brief introduction of Adriana de Souza e Silva. She's a professor at the Department of Communication at North Carolina State University and affiliated faculty at the Science, Technology, and Society program at the same university. She has a bachelor's degree in social communication and journalism from Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, 1997, and her master's is in communication and image technology, also gotten at Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, 1999. She holds a PhD in communication and culture from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro as well, 2004. Dr. de Souza Silva's research focuses on how mobile and locative interfaces shape people's interactions with public spaces and create new forms of sociability. She teaches classes on mobile technologies, location-based games, and internet studies. Dr. de Souza Silva is the co-editor and co-author of several books, including Net Locality, Why Location Matters in a Networked World, Blackwell 2011, with Eric Gordon, Mobile Interfaces in Public Spaces, Control, Privacy, and Urban Sociability, Routledge 2012, with Jordan Frith, and Mobility and Locative Media, Mobile Communication in Hybrid Spaces, from Routledge 2014, with Mimi Scheller, and the book proposal for the Stanford University Press that she kindly sent to us, right? Creativity as Survival, the Politics of Mobile Networked Practice with Sorry, Adriana, I'm going to read the name. It's Mai No Xiong Gam. Is something like this? Yes? Thank you. Today, Professor Adriana is going to talk about her current projects that signify the combination of technology and creativity in different environments with different ways of appropriation. Thank you very much, Professor Adriana, to be with us today. It's a great pleasure and honor to be with you. And now let's listen to Creativity as Survival, the Politics of Mobile Networked Practice. Thank you very much, Adriana. It's your turn now. You can share your slides, please.
All right, thank you. Let me just share here. Okay, can you all see?
Yes, we can.
But I lost you. 1 second, because I was. I want to still see your faces. Let me try to do it what I did before. Okay. Can you still see?
Yes, we can.
All right. Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me for this talk. I was asked to speak in English. Sometimes I always feel a little awkward to speak in English for majority Brazilian audience, but I know that there are non-Brazilians too, so it's okay. And if you ask any questions, just feel free to ask either in Portuguese or in English. Doesn't matter to me. So it's really a pleasure for me to be kind of sharing here a little bit of this work that I'm doing right now, because this is a work that we are currently developing. And that's why I wanted to share this book proposal, because we are actually writing this book as we speak. So really, although we've been developing this idea of mobile network creativity since 2020. So it's been about 3 years. So the ideas has been maturing, and but I really welcome any feedback that you might have. So I just would like to start with this kind of traditional idea of creativity, because when she was my PhD student, and now she's a professor at Furman University, and she had this research on refugees and forced migrants. And I had all this research on location-based games and media, and also a lot of work with people, how people appropriate cell phones, either in the favelas or in black markets. And one day we were kind of talking with each other and said, well, these are actually kind of creative ways of dealing, because she was looking at how migrants would use technologies and cell phones in ways that were non-normative or not expected by the designers of technologies, right? And that was the same thing I kind of was doing in Brazil. And we were like, well, I think I think there's a connection between these ideas, because we're both talking about creativity, although most people don't talk about creativity in this way. And then we are kind of started doing all this research about what is creativity, right? And this is kind of really fascinating, because there's a lot of a big area called creativity studies, which is mostly management and innovation, that kind of try to define creativity really sometimes by quantitative methodologies, like with surveys and Likert scales. But also we all have this kind of ingrained idea of what creativity is. So I just would like to ask a question to the panelists. I mean, if I say creativity, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? I mean, is there like a picture that comes up?
Now I have a different idea about it, because I have read your texts, right? Because usually you have the idea of being creating as a talent, something that we have as an inherent gift, yes? And this is what you say here, right? During your reading, I could imagine that, of course, this is not true, because it's a work. You need to elaborate too much, right? To attain some objectives that you want, something like that. So I have a different idea, right? Because you offered me a different point of view, right?
Yeah. Anyone else wanted to?
I would say about unusual way to work or to use a kind of interface or methodology, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Say this, unusual way, unusual perspective, work with.
Yeah. And also, I think, Luisa is an artist too. And I think a lot of our idea of creativity comes from artists, right? And although art can be subversive as well, and normally goes against normative expectations, but a lot of times, the kind of a traditional, most like common sense idea of creativity includes, somebody like this picture who is kind of alone, has a lot of time to think and introspection, and has some kind of training or motivation and time and resources to be creative, right? And that's exactly what we are trying to do, is not to change what creativity is, but to kind of reframe how we think about creativity. It's not that we are saying, oh, these ways of thinking of creativity are wrong, but there are other ways too that we need to consider, and sometimes we don't call them creativity, especially when we think in our relationships with technology and spaces. So we started looking into creativity as kind of this practice that arises from this networked and recursive relationships that involve mobile technologies, displaced and in-place communities in situations of hardship. And that's important for us because a lot of times we think of, and I'm going to talk in more detail about that, as creativity as something related to innovation or something that is related to a product. You create something, right? But what we are trying to get at is that we are talking about a process, not a product. So it is something that it's a practice that's a recurrent or emergent practice that can only happen in specific contexts, and it emerges from these networked relationships between people, technologies, and spaces. So it's not a person who is creative. It's the relationships they have with their community, their environments, and their technologies, and all of them co-construct each other. So we cannot think about one without the other. And if we change, like when we study networks, if we change one component of this kind of assemblage, we're going to have a different configuration of what it is to be creative. So I just wanted to kind of change my screen here, and you might have seen this video already, but it's a 2-minute video that we recorded. I'm going to play the Portuguese version. Should I play the Portuguese or the English version?
Doesn't matter. I think
Okay.
they can understand, right?
Just kind of that summarizes this idea. Oh, and I don't remember if I shared sound. Let me just do it again so I can. Oh, yes, I did.
Criatividade está na moda hoje em dia. Cada vez mais, são publicados livros e revistas ensinando as pessoas a serem mais criativas. Mas essa ideia de criatividade está ligada a tendências capitalistas de produção e de consumo, onde criatividade é um termo usado para motivar as pessoas a trabalharem mais, vencerem a competição e terem sucesso no ambiente de trabalho. Criatividade é tradicionalmente caracterizada como algo que se consegue através de intensa concentração e contemplação, quer dizer, uma atividade essencialmente individual e restrita àquelas pessoas que têm tempo e dinheiro para serem criativas. Mas as práticas criativas também podem acontecer fora dessa visão tradicional. A criatividade acontece também em situações de dificuldade, onde indivíduos não têm acesso a recursos, tempo ou dinheiro. Essas práticas são frequentemente rotuladas como ilegais e subversivas e descritas como apropriação, em vez de criatividade. Mas quando moradores de favelas ou refugiados modificam tecnologias para melhorar suas vidas, eles não estão apenas apropriando tecnologia, eles estão coletivamente recriando seus ambientes com a tecnologia e reinventando a si próprios e suas comunidades. A criatividade móvel em rede é um processo que depende de recursos em rede e mobilidade, num ambiente que conecta indivíduos e tecnologias. Por exemplo, no campo de refugiados sírio no Jordão, onde as ruas não são asfaltadas e o acesso a cadeiras de roda é limitado, Safwan Harb criou uma bicicleta elétrica feita de partes de outros veículos que estavam disponíveis no campo. Ao fazer isso, ele não estava apenas reinventando uma bicicleta cadeira de rodas, mas também construindo uma forma diferente de mobilidade e recriando a si próprio como uma pessoa bicicleta cadeira de rodas. Assim, criatividade móvel em rede não é um processo que está preocupado com a criação de coisas novas. Ao contrário, é como a mobilidade e conexão de recursos podem melhorar a vida de grupos de pessoas e facilitar táticas de sobrevivência em meio a dificuldades.
Just gonna reshare my screen here so I can see you again. Okay, so what I want to do in the next 20 minutes or so is basically talk about these three frames that we came up in our research to understand creativity in the literature, mostly as an artistic practice, an individual process, and innovation. Talk a little bit about the frameworks of adoption and appropriation that normally have been used in communication studies for understanding creative practices and technology, with technology specifically. And then talk a little bit about the examples of mobile network creativity that are going to lead to the activity I want to propose. So as I said, and we said in the video, I mean, creativity, I mean, one of the oldest concepts of creativity is related to artistic practices, right? I think the image of the artist or the painter or the writer is one of the major icons of when we think about creativity. And in fact, the word creativity has used in one of the first times to define Shakespeare work in 1875. And then later on was used to describe all sorts of, artistic creations like, playing music or painting, but everything that requires some kind of inspiration. But then, we started questioning, okay, those are definitely creative practices, but what about, non-artistic practices or power dynamics, when there are like frictions or power asymmetries that influence what people create? And again, is creativity always good? Because we normally, when we think of a traditional painting or music, it's something very kind of positive. But then you look at, bombs created with cell phones or hacking labs. And I mean, that's definitely creative practices, but they are normally seen as kind of a negative connotation. So how do we frame those practices too within those traditional ideas of creativity? And another issue that we had with this traditional view of creativity is that normally it has been talked about as an individual process, right? A lot of times when we talk about innovation and creation, people focus on the person who created. And of course, in art, this is very the issue of authorship is very strong, right? The author of a book, the artist who did a painting, or, also in science, we immediately think of, Archimedes in the bathtub that had this, eureka idea, or the thinker, or Newton, like watching the apple fall. It's like something that people come up with creative ideas in a moment of enlightenment. And that's actually related to the kind of Western Greek tradition of the word creativity, because in the ancient, with the Greeks, there was no concept for creativity. It was actually the Greek word was the same idea for genius. And traditionally, that was a concept applied to God. So like only God would be powerful enough to create things. So people would just copy, right? That's the kind of a Platonic idea of the copy, would not create original things. But then later on, with the humanist tradition, people start focusing on man and humans, then this idea of creation was transferred to people, but they also had to be divinely inspired, right? You had to have that spark and that thing that was out of the ordinary. So that meant that creativity was always seen as something that's beyond the ordinary or our kind of daily lives. So another problem is that, I mean, especially for studies and people in management and psychology, for example, it was much easier to, how can you know if something, so if you have a process in which you define this is creative and this is not creative, or some people are divinely inspired and some are not, how do you know who are the people who have the gift of creativity? And to find out that a lot of researchers started like doing studies and surveys about, you know, IQ tests and memory tests, attention tests, to kind of figure out who is more creative, right? So you put like creativity into quantitative scale. But then, you know, that is actually kind of a convenient sampling because it's easier to figure out when a person is creative than with when a group of people, for example, you know, are creative. When people work in groups, and one of the things we're talking about in the book is that creativity not only emerges from an individual process, but it's also a collective process. And obviously this idea is not new, right? What we're talking about, like, for example, the internet, I mean, in the early 2000s, a lot of people were Pierre Levy and wrote The Collective Intelligence, talking about how digital networks would enable different people from different parts of the globe to come together and create something, right? And come up with new ideas. Actually, I just put that light bulb there, which is a vignette from Stephen Johnson's book, Where Good Ideas Come From, which I really like. And he talks about two interesting things for this argument. First of all, is this idea that in order to have good ideas, we need to have contact with other people. So he talks about the coffee houses in the 18th century as one of the places where and the Enlightenment, where a lot of good ideas emerged, because people were it was a place that people could get together, right? So we need these spaces where different minds come together, and then we can create more. And then in the 90s and the 2000s, this space kind of became the internet. And the other thing he talks about is this idea of the long hunch, which means that this kind of debunking this idea that creative ideas come in an enlightenment or in a, you know, sudden thought that's like, oh, I had this, like the Archimedes eureka moment, right? That normally when you have good ideas, they're incubated sometimes for years, right? For example, the World Wide Web with Tim Berners-Lee. I mean, he was working on that project for over 10 years, and he started, you know, working a little bit here in his free time and did the work on the CERN lab in another time, and then came back and put it away and came back, but only when and it was not just Tim Berners-Lee, right? He had contact with other people in CERN that helped develop that idea, but normally what happens? The popular press and media and people talked, oh, the World Wide Web was invented by Tim Berners-Lee, which is a more simplified way of talking about inventions, but that's not how they actually happen, right? So we're trying to kind of reframe and think, oh, well, creativity is actually this collective process. Another thing that we are actually, you know, you probably think that creativity actually became like a buzzword in the last maybe 5 to 10 years or so, right? There's lots of books that's like, how can you be more creative, or how teaching, as if it's some skill that people can actually learn. And there are several companies, for example, Google, that institutionalized this 80-20 so that you can have 20% of your time to work on your personal project. So you're kind of working at the company, but then, whatever you create is part of Google's copyright, So it is kind of enticing people to be creative, but working for some kind of corporate goal, and in which creativity is kind of framed and developed as, within the part of our capitalistic society where people are working for something. And in that case, creativity is specifically related to invention and innovation. So being creative means creating a new product, a new app, a new website, or something like that, right? Just like the process of creativity is not giving a lot of thought. So it's kind of related to this idea of developing products, practices, services that are, potentially useful to the organizations and not necessarily to the people who create those. So moving that a little bit from, and that was a lot of what we saw in the creativity studies literature, but, in communication, we studied these ideas of technology, diffusion, adoption, appropriation for a long time. And interestingly, a lot of times we don't talk about these things as creativity. We talk about technology adoption, technology appropriation, and appropriation is normally framed as a subversive practice or something that's negative. And normally this process of diffusion and adoption was generally looked at. I mean, it started in organizational communication, but it's very individual process, right? And a top-down process. So companies create products. So, for example, a cell phone is developed, and then they are first, diffused into society, and then there are early adopters, and then it's diffused to the larger public, and more people started using, and that's kind of like the kind of top-down diffusion process. Sometimes it takes into consideration how people actually use the technologies, and that kind of informs back the design of technologies. There's some kind of feedback loop there, but there's a clear division between who creates the technologies and the people who actually uses the technologies. There are lots of different perspectives on that. And one of them I think are more interesting is from Francois Barr. He has this study on the techniques of appropriation, in which actually he uses some examples of use of cell phones in Brazil. And he talks about appropriation as creative practices from 3 different perspectives or categories. One of them, he says, well, there are 3 kind of levels of appropriation. One of them is the most maybe obvious and less damaging, which would be the bureaucratization, right? So, for example, he says, when you just get a technology and you're still using the way it was intended, but you can change it a little bit. So when users, like you add a new cell phone case to your phone, or put charms and different ringtones that people used to do, in the past, so that this way, like, you're still using the technology as it was intended, but you're putting out a tone of personalization on the use of that technology. So the second phase, or the second category, what he called creolization, involved a lot of times still using technologies as they were intended, but with some kind of subversive, like when you change, it's a kind of non-confrontational change. So that was the example he used, was when, like, cell phones that people used to have lots of different chips or SIM cards, and from different providers. And depending on, the time of the day or the promotion, you would swap the SIM card to get a discount or to talk to different people. And And that actually ended up influencing technology designers because they started developing cell phones with multiple slots for SIM cards that people could swap, which is something that people here in the US, for example, still never heard about because people never did that, right? So it's like a very much like South American, probably other global South countries as well. And the third one that we thought was more interesting and related to what we are talking about was what he called cannibalism, which it actually was inspired by the cannibalist movement, art movement in Brazil, which is actually when you have a confrontation and a friction and power asymmetry between the technology creators and the people who use the technology, but you're actually changing and subverting the meaning of that technology. So for example, when you use a cell phone as a bomb, right? You're kind of, that was not the original intent, but that's why people were talking about it. It doesn't necessarily need to be bad. I'm using like a terrorist example here, but there are many examples of subversion of technologies, and when you kind of take them out of context, that are also creative practices, but they normally have been framed as appropriation, right? So that actually takes us to the idea of mobile network creativity, that we kind of develop this further. And instead of focusing on the specific innovation or the technology that was created, we are saying that this process is actually, as I mentioned, an emergent and ongoing process, and it's networked, that it involves technologies, people, and spaces, so that we cannot understand a creative practice only as something that's inside somebody's mind. You know, it's created as when people in communities work together, but it emerges, and this is the specific context we are working on. And I'm not saying that this doesn't happen in other contexts, but particularly in situations where people are in situations of hardship, so that when it's the opposite of the traditional idea of creativity, right? That you have access to resources and money and time. And here, when you see people that actually don't have resources, or the proper resources, they do have resources, don't have money, or they don't have time, but still they come up with creative solutions to their environment and to connect with other people. This picture, by the way, is just a cell phone solar charging station in Africa. And, you know, it's just a service provided where people don't have electricity, and so they can charge their phones. So in that sense, we're kind of constructing this concept as like a three-part concept. First of all, the idea of mobile means not only working with mobile technologies, but also dynamic, something that's always ongoing and related to mobile physical mobility as well, that it's related to people who are either, but not just like refugees or people who are constantly moving around, but also people who are in place or who can't move because, or they're what we call in place, right? Because they don't have access to resources. Secondly, it's networked, which means that it's something that's created not only by the connection between people, technologies, and spaces, but also the connection among people and communities. And finally, when we say it's spatial, it's because it's related to the context and the spaces where people are. So sometimes we forget that creativity and all kinds of creative practices, they are related to, like when Stephen Johnson talked about the coffee houses in the 18th century, right? They're spaces that would promote creativity. So what are these spaces, right? Why some creativity and creative practices occur in some spaces and not in others? So we're trying to understand how that process works. And so I just want to give some examples of what we started thinking of, how that practice unfolds, right? And some of those are in the text you read, but I just want to talk through them a little bit more. And the first one is one that might be familiar to a lot of a lot of you, especially, you know, this is from Rio and was actually shared with me from my cousin. So he had this, his son would go to Poki Rio by bus. And sometimes, you know, they would be like hours. He used to take the bus every day, and sometimes the bus would just not come. And he would be waiting the bus for hours, and there was not, you know, there's apps like Move It or that track buses, or that it would just not work. And finally, one of the passengers, I think was the bus driver, created this WhatsApp group that, you know, would basically broadcast to potential passengers when the bus would come. So people would just get in the group, and then they would say, oh, the bus is coming, we just left Cosme Velho, we're gonna be in Laranjeiras in 10 minutes and turning the corner. So it is kind of like, instead of creating a proprietary app that people need to download or have a smartphone to use, was something like grassroots or bottom up, created by the users of the transportation system in a specific situation of hardship and difficulty, where the bus company actually kind of fired all the bus drivers and took all the other bus lines from working and left people without resources to be able to move around. So the people, they created a system not to increase their mobility and to make it more efficient so that they could actually get somewhere. So they're not creating a new product, they're just using a tool that everybody uses, but reframing it in their context to help with their daily mobility. Another one that's a little bit more subversive, which you probably also heard about, is how sometimes, you know, scooters were, you know, this rental scooters that you rent with your cell phone, and they had, you know, geolocated mechanisms that they would actually stop working if they're taken outside of their geographic area. But there are a lot of stories there, people actually, they can, you know, remove the GPS on them and then transform them on regular scooters and sell on like Facebook Marketplace. So you're kind of, and I think the interesting thing of that example, of course, it's an illegal practice, but it's not just about saying, oh, they're not inventing a new scooter, but they are kind of reframing that scooter that was used as a rental vehicle as a traditional scooter, but it's also connected to power asymmetries, the legal practices that happen in black markets, the scooter companies that rent the scooters, but also the lack of access of some people to this kind of transportation, right? Because if we saw, now you don't have many scooters anymore, and I think in Rio and São Paulo probably too, but initially the bikes too, they were mostly placed in wealthy zones of the city, so they would just serve a specific part of the population. So it was kind of a workaround to give access to other people. And I think this idea of workaround is very important here, because one of the things that in the chapters in the book that we are writing about, we're comparing this idea that you're probably very familiar with of the gambiarra, right? That we have that in Brazil all the time, which is like you were working around and creating something new to kind of work with the deficiency of your environment when you don't have access to the proper thing. Although the difference here is that what we are saying is that the gambiarra focuses on the thing itself, and we are focusing on the process. But the gambiarra is part of this process, right? It's an example of when people create some things that use their things that are available for them in their environment. And also sometimes when we think about, let me go back here. When we think about the gambiarra, a lot of times we think of people, oh, the individual is still focused on the individual, right? Like, oh, somebody created that. But when we think of how community creates things. So for example, the gato example that I used, you know, those clandestine connections in favelas, that's a great example of a gambiarra that's made by a community to solve a problem that they have with lack of electricity and services. So no, there's no author or authorship in create. That's an extremely creative solution, but it's not something, oh, that individual created that. And I'm just gonna jump this because it's the same example of the video that I showed you about the wheelchair in the refugee camp. And still, I mean, the interesting thing about this is that once I was giving an interview at the NC State blog, and they were talking about this project, and I mentioned this example, and the guy who was interviewing me, he was like, oh, but how is that an example of mobile network? You're saying that creativity is not individual, but the individual created this bike. And I was like, yes, but it's not that we're removing the individual from the picture, but we're actually emphasizing that he would not be able to have created that if he was alone in the camp, right? That he used, and it's not just about the other people that might have gave him parts of the bike or might have taught him how to connect and sew parts together, but also the technology itself kind of builds and changes who he is, right? So it's a different, and the fact that he's in a refugee camp, he would probably not have created that if he was in a different place. So it's a way of understanding this process from a different frame. I also had questions, because I've been talking about this idea with several colleagues, and another colleague that I have, Eric Gordon, who was my former co-author, that he's in civic media, and he does a lot of design works. And he was like, oh, but how this is different than co-design, for example, which is another thing that today in design, people talk a lot about the collective creative process, that kind of decentering also design from the individual creator. And I was thinking about that a lot. And I was like, well, definitely there is a connection. I mean, I think designers finally realized that you cannot talk about creativity or creation from an individual perspective. So it's not something that's new, but what we are kind of emphasizing here is not just people together, that technologies also have some agency, and they co-create with us and we co-create with them, and using this spatial context as well to talk about. So there's this two different things. And in addition to that, we are specifically focusing on mobile and networked technologies, because I think the network part is what makes it different as well. So to conclude a little bit, I think, mobile network creativity, just to kind of summarize what I've been talking about, emerges from this kind of set of relationships. So the important thing here is the relationships, right, that develop and overlap over space and time as a social response to unplanned and emergent exigencies. So it is not, normally when we think of innovation, people have an intent to create something, right? And I'm not saying that the Saffron Harbor, the refugee camp, he didn't have the intent to create the bike, but it's normally a response to some emergent situation or unplanned thing. So like with a gambiarra, for example, it's something that just happens, you're like, oh, I don't have how to fix this, let me just make this on the fly. So there's an element there of serendipity and chance that we want to explore. And the second important thing is that it's related. It's a system of power struggles and friction against normative forces. So these things that we're talking about, they really occur in places where you have socioeconomic inequalities and difficulties in access to proper technologies. So I already talked about the gato, which is the middle picture there. The one on the left is from... it's this cell phone ladies in Bangladesh, that this is over 20 years ago, that they would started, creating business with the Grameen Bank, where they would rent cell phone minutes. That was like, so that when most people didn't have access to their individual cell phones or any cell phone in their villages, and if one person has a cell phone, they would use that as a public phone. And the last one is another cell phone solar power charging station. So what I wanted to do now is kind of show a little bit of our project site. Can you see the screen that I changed? Okay. So one of the things, I mean, that I like about this project is that we are so excited about this idea that we're creating different things on top of that. So one thing, we started with the that communication theory article I shared, and then the idea grew, and it's like, well, let's just write a book about it, because we have a lot of things that we want to talk. But then on top of that, we decided, well, I think in order to write a book, but also to develop, we need to collect more examples of mobile network creativity. And we really would like to, we started creating this resource, which is basically to get people's input, and so that people can submit examples that they know that can match those concepts. And so we created this video that explains what it is. I did the Portuguese version, but my idea is to do it in different languages. So if anybody has like another language skill that would like to contribute, I'm getting volunteers. But we have, if you click here, we have this form that people can, it's basically just a Google form that you can fill up, and then if you submit your examples, you just kind of explain what it is, describe what it is, and explain why you think it's a mobile network creativity example. And you can actually describe it with words or add a audio file, put the location and the year of when that happened. If there's anything else you wanted to know, and if you want it to be anonymous or not, your submission. And then you click submit, it goes to our file, and we can kind of then upload to the website. So that's one way of contributing. And here on the research part, I'm just kind of putting stuff that we've been doing about this project. So there is the blog that I told you about, that I was having this argument with the NC State media person about who is creative. This is a presentation. I think the video is not loading. Yeah, that we did at ICA in Australia. It was virtual. That's why I have the video, but people can watch later if you want, and the papers that we published. So just gonna add in here. But the interesting part that I want to show is this one, where we are collecting the examples. And there's a lot of things that I already mentioned here. So for example, the bike wheelchair here, the Buzz 581 WhatsApp group. There are also others that I just want to mention very quickly that I think are interesting. This was a colleague of mine from the Philippines that told me about this, what it's called the Habao, which is basically a motorcycle taxi that they have in this island in the Philippines, where it's very mountainous. So you don't have a lot of roads, and the whole roads are very steep and narrow. So they cannot have like four-wheeled vehicles. They don't work very well, like regular taxis or buses. So a lot of people drive around in motorcycles. But then they needed to carry more people in motorcycles because they don't have enough motorcycles. So what they did is to put like two wooden boards cross horizontally on the motorcycle, and then they can pile up people, and people can transport up to 10 people on this motorcycle. Obviously, it's risky, and there are stories of accidents, but it is a way of dealing with a situation of precarity in a creative way that kind of attends those people's needs on that specific island. The other one that I loved when I found out is this project called Pedala Queimados. I'm not sure if anyone is familiar with that, but it's Queimados is a city in the state of Rio, and they had a lot of problems, especially after the pandemic, with transportation, right? Actually, the city became one of the most violent in Brazil because there were a lot of evictions during the World Cup and the Olympics, and a lot of those people went to transferred to Queimados without jobs and without any sort of infrastructure or support. And so this guy called Carlos Greenbike, and he's very like a proponent of green transportation, and he would always bike, and he biked to work in Rio 50 kilometers just to show people that could be done. But then people also didn't have access to bikes, so they actually talked. There was this guy from Belgium who went there and helped them to gave a workshop in how to create bikes out of bamboo parts. And so they create these bikes with bamboo so that people, and they actually ran those bikes on WhatsApp. So it's like a kind of a sharing system as well. So, and there are other examples here, but I think I'm going to stop sharing my screen at this point because we have about 20 minutes, and I would love to, hear from you if you have any questions or if there's any aspects of the text that you wanted to discuss a little bit more. I cannot hear. Oh, okay, now I can.
Adriana, thank you very much. It was an honor to be with you because after all, your development of studies on creativity are very important, not just for technology, but also I think they are connected to philosophical studies as well, right? And something I'd like to tell you is that there is a concept of Deleuze and Guattari about becoming that you have used it, right, in some place. I don't know if it's written in the book or in the article that you have written. And I think it's perfect here, right? Because the becoming is something that changes with any different encounter, right? Anytime you find out something different and you have a different thing, you have a different, I'd say that agenciamento in Portuguese, in English, you say, in French, you say agencement, right? It's something that is related to what you have said, right? You have connection, people, technology, things, and then you have a becoming, something that is not, it's sometimes accidental and sometimes is connected to the event itself, with the place, with people. So I think becoming, that we say devir in Portuguese, right, is a very important concept that I believe that is connected to what you have said, right? It's the way we become others or become other things, right? And I think it's completely adapted to what you have said. And another thing, right, that I'd say, because when I was reading your text and your studies, I was visiting some of your experiments and research, I'd say that you touch some decolonial studies, right, in the way more than globalization, we have the term mundialization, right? When you say that, that's Mignolo says, I don't remember the name of the book, but I think it's Gloco something. And he says, mundialization are local histories in which global designs are enacted, or where they have to be adapted, adopted, transformed, and re-articulated, right? Both local histories are mediated by the structure of power, and what you said. So it's very interesting to connect philosophical studies to what you have said here, right? Because it's completely, they are familiar, right, to what we are touching. right? And I have a question that's not a question because you have already answered it, but just to provoke some debate, right? Do you think the way people are with technologies, because they are not just, I don't think they use just technology, they are technologies, right? They are connected to. And so the way people are with technology, adapt them, technologies to their own needs, can be considered a way of surviving and resisting the worst of capitalism. And how can we fight against its trend, capitalism's trend of guessing our needs and desires? Because it's a very unfair fight, right? You have capitalism and we have our own way of, in a collective way of resisting to that. What do you think about this?
Sorry, I was muted. So yeah, those are big questions. But so the three things here. First, about Deleuze and becoming. Yes, I'm very, as you can see, I'm very inspired by Deleuze and Guattari. I think there are some key ideas. First, this idea of becoming, of things that are always emergent and kind of changing, but also the idea of rhizome that has been used a lot, because the rhizome is a network, but it's a network that's in constant stage of becoming, right? So that the parts, and you have not parts that are more important than the other, but it's like they're like on a plane, right? So I think we're really inspired by those ideas. But also, I think a lot of times, today, a lot of people are talking about complex systems and complexity. And I think that's related to what we are talking about, where we think of like that the system, it's like more than the sum of its parts. So if you just get one thing, the person or the space or the technology, you're going to have one thing. But if you look at this as a system and parts that are influencing each other, you have something. Then you have a creativity, right? Something different emerges out of it. So I think there's something to learn from complexity theory as well in there. And that actually leads to that idea that what you're talking about with technologies. And I saw a comment on the chat saying that how, if technology sometimes que a tecnologia atrapalha, né? But then my question is, what is technology, right? Because I think that depends on how we understand what technology is. Because if you understand technology as just like the new thing or digital technologies or a cell phone, yes, then we can think of how they, change the way we talk to each other. Or but these accounts are. The problem is that they are thinking of technology as something separate from us. And as Eliane said, we are our technologies, right? And I really like, Kevin Kelly has a book called What Technology Wants, in which he actually, we talk about that in the book. I don't know if one of these chapters that I sent, but that we co-evolve with our technologies, and technologies are not just material things. They're actually anything that's produced by our brain. So it can be an immaterial thing. It can be and we can everything that we interact in our daily lives are technology. Obviously, my glasses are technology, my pen is a technology, but not just material things. A software is a technology, or anything that I create is a technology. So from that perspective, we are inseparable than our technologies. And one of the things he actually says is imagine a world without technology. It just remove all the technology from it. We would not be able to survive for a long time on that. Actually, we as a human species, we would die off because our biology has adapted with technology throughout the years, starting with the domestication of fires, thinking of fire as a technology, right? So that it changed when we start cooking food, it changed our biology and the way we digest, that we cannot survive with just raw food anymore. So it is something, that's what I mean when I say that things construct each other. it's just seeing that we are technologies and our technologies become us as well. And the same for our spaces. So it's just a different way of understanding.
Thank you, Adriana. And I think we have some questions here, some comments, right? For example, William says something here in the chat. Would like to talk to Adriana. You can speak Portuguese if you want, right? Don't worry. Adriana, I love it, the example with the flip-flops, you know? O suporte de celular.
Yeah, that was a gambiarra, right?
That's
A typical gambiarra.
That's wonderful. Um chinelo havaiana, and then they use the flip-flop, right, to put the cell phone there, and then you have that on the car, right? For example, usually you want to go to places and you need to have your cell phone to maps, Waze, things like that. It's
exactly.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I mean, I just saw in the chat here that there's like law and language are also technologies. Yeah. I mean, I teach this course called Communication and Technology that we actually start with this domestication of fire and then the creation of language and then the first, proto-writing alphabet, just because we need to have this broader understanding of what technology is. But, as William was saying, I mean, he was specifically talking about social media and games. But then, as with every media, I mean, I always say, well, we can look at, there are positive things that come with it and negative things. There are sometimes, but again, I'm trying to not to fall into a media effects perspective that says, oh, some violent video games make people violent, or people get addicted to phones because phones are addictive. But in order to understand our relationships with technologies, and I say relationships because it's not just the technology, right? We need to look into the environment where those people are. I mean, like if there's a kid that's, let's say, I don't like that word, but addicted to a cell phone, I mean, what kind of family situation they have? They have other educations, people support. So I think it takes more than the technology to say that they do something. And obviously, I do think that technologies have agency, but people as well. So it's like when you look at from a actor network theory perspective, for example, that you have the nodes of the network are not just people, but it can be technologies, can be other things, human and non-human actants, and they all influence each other, right? So it's not just that technologies do things for us and we do things from technologies, and it gets much more complex, right? But I think that's how we need to understand. It's like a relational, it's about the relationships and not just the things. And obviously we need to study each individual context, right? I mean, not all social media is bad. There's good things. Not all games are bad. And I normally avoid, actually, I always tell my students to look at things from a binary perspective, because everything in the world, if you're going to say there's good and bad, so it's much more productive to think about what are the implications? How does that change our society? How it changes our social and communication relationships? The how is the key, and not just the positive and negative, right?
And another thing, Adriana, is the property of creation. That's a problem, right? Because we think about capitalism, is the way that we have an idea, when you have an idea, and then you need to have property of an idea. And it's against what you have said, right? Is the way that if you have you share the ideas and people can use them, so the appropriation of it is good, can be good. It can be bad as well, right? As you said. But of course, it's creative anyway, right? Because you have the idea. And I remembered, I think you know that, and children fly kites in Rio de Janeiro when the police is coming to the places, the hills, the favelas, and then they use children to fly kites, right? To warn that police coming, right? This is another way of being, right? It's a kind of jeitinho brasileiro, right? Of having this. Children are playing, but of course they use children, right, to show that the police is coming, so they need to stop. For example, when you have drug dealers, etc., right?
Yeah.
I remember that one, but it's an old example, right?
Right, and I love what Ana Paula said in the chat, that creativity is a form of resistance. It is, and this example of flying kites is a form of resistance, and that's why I think it's when we think of capitalism, I mean, a lot of times I think this idea of creativity and innovation has been appropriated a lot by corporations and, you know, and capitalism, but what we're trying to think is like exactly not just the top-down instances, but the bottom-up grassroots organizations and ways that creativity can emerge as a response to local situations. And once I was also talking to somebody, they said, oh, how can you, how do you think this can be useful, like in a practical way? Because I talked about a lot of theories here, but I think, if we really can create a big database of practices or creative practices that emerge in situations of hardship and people who live in precarious situations, I mean, sometimes, governments or NGOs can be informed because a lot of times people say, oh, I'm going to help that community and try to come up with pre-established solutions with what they think is going to be good for them. But if you actually understand how people live in these situations, or maybe take examples of other communities who live in similar ways and kind of can apply those to other people who are in precarious situations, then you're not imposing, your global north or your privileged populations or privileged ideas to marginalized populations. So I think it's about creating a consciousness of people and maybe working with governments and technology developers and NGOs that can actually understand that process and include communities and people also in that process. So it's trying to kind of revert a little bit, that system. And since I need to go soon, I just wanted to, can I talk about the activity that I would like to do?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Tá, então vou falar em português, que você pediu para eu explicar a atividade em português, né? Uma das coisas que a gente queria tá fazendo é justamente coletar esses exemplos de criatividade em rede. Então, se a gente tivesse mais tempo, eu queria poder ficar aqui, mas de repente vocês podem se organizar em grupos e fazer isso depois e me mandar o resultado das discussões. Se pudesse fazer grupos de 2, 3 ou 4 pessoas e, primeiro, discutir como que vocês entendem essa ideia de criatividade e ver se vocês conhecem algum exemplo dessa criatividade em rede nas comunidades que vocês conhecem. Podem ser coisas que vocês experimentaram ou coisas que vocês ouviram falar, ou se você não souber, pode fazer uma pesquisa no Google online, mas tentar explicar por que você acha que esse exemplo, exatamente o que a gente tem no formulário ali de contribuir, né? É um exemplo de criatividade móvel em rede e por que seria relevante para mudar como a gente percebe criatividade.
Perfeito.
E aí, se vocês pudessem, os alunos pudessem escrever isso e depois, se eu pudesse coletar e mandar para mim, eu agradeceria. Depois eu posso até dar feedback também. E a gente, se quiser que a gente coloque no nosso site, eu coloco também.
Perfeito, Adriana. A gente faz isso sim, já está com homework. Acho que é importante também.
Tem um site aí, Adriana?
Eu vou botar aqui o link no chat.
Alguém mais gostaria de fazer algum comentário? Porque a Adriana precisa sair. E é óbvio, né? Queria agradecer demais, Adriana. Foi um momento muito interessante para a gente, né? A sua lecture nos ajuda a entender essa relação das tecnologias não como um anexo, mas como parte da gente, que eu acho que isso é muito importante, e também como a gente pode usar a tecnologia a nosso favor. Quando eu digo a nosso favor, é a favor dos subalternos, né? Porque, na verdade, nós, como brasileiros, vivemos, né, num país dos subalternos, e como é que a gente pode criar efetivamente disso. Acho que você deu para a gente uma aula e tanto, eu agradeço muito, em nome de todos nós, em nome da PUC, em nome da cátedra e dos participantes aqui, do Media Lab Brasil, tá? Que eu acho que foi muito, muito legal para a gente. E a leitura também, pode deixar que a gente te manda o feedback dessa contribuição. Acho que todo mundo tem bastante a contribuir.
Tá,
Bom, Luiz?
obrigada. E eu, além dos exemplos, se alguém quiser dar algum feedback no livro, nas ideias também, eu agradeço.
Tá bom.
Então
A gente
tá,
faz.
eu vou lá. Mas vamos manter contato e que eu preciso sair para pegar minha filha na ginástica agora.
Tá ótimo. Muito obrigada, Adriana. Luísa?
Obrigada, não,
Tá.
obrigada,
Obrigada,
Adriana.
Adriana.
Beijo grande.
Tchau.
Tchau.